All right, I'm gonna say hello to everybody we have so far. We're gonna hold entry open for a couple more minutes. Troy and I were just sort of chatting about his hives and what's going on with them. And I have one of my own hives that I moved recently, and I had to leave it behind when I'm going this weekend to see where it's at. But we're gonna leave this open a couple more minutes and then we're gonna get started. So the idea here is Troy is gonna go through his presentation. There is the ability over on the right-hand side of your screen in Zoom for you to be able to either type messages, questions, or we'll open it up at the end. Everybody is automatically muted as they come in just because there's a lot of, that can create a lot of chaos as people are coming, because I'm going to allow people in a little after, 7. So we don't want to disrupt everybody else, but certainly, we're going to take questions at the end. You can type them in the chat box over there, or just hold them until I open it up at the end, and certainly if Troy feels like he's at a point where he wants to take a question or two, we'll do that. I am Dawn. I am the Director of Marketing at West Lebanon Bean Supply, and this is, as everybody knows, Troy Hall. He's our pal and our resident expert in all things bees. So like I said, just a couple more minutes and then we'll let Troy get going on sharing his knowledge. And thank you all for spending your Tuesday evening. I know it's these days there's not a lot of other things to do, but this is definitely something that's a lot of fun to get into if you're interested in it. I've been sort of dabbling in it for 3 years now, and it's a really fun hobby, and Troy's made an amazing business out of it that I'm very thankful for, because I've yet to be able to get my own honey, so I buy yours.
I always tell people that's the hardest part. Everyone thinks you can just buy bees, and sure, if you're lucky, for the most part, you can get a couple colonies, and they'll build up, and you might get a couple pails of honey or something, or a pail of honey. But the trick is trying to keep them alive.
Yeah.
so you don't have your honey. You're not constantly paying for your bees by selling all the honey off or what. But that's the secret. It's just how to keeping your bees sustaining themselves.
Well, and that's the funny part is it's like sustaining them, because sure, you could take their honey, but they're not going to make it through the winter, and that's like the balance is like the cost of the bees or maybe just not taking the honey.
Well, so that's the thing. Not too long ago, like 15-20 years ago, even before then, if you go back in the before, I'm not, this is way before my time, but in the 70s and early 80s, I was just a kid, but I still am to a degree, but it's a pound of honey was 50 cents a pound, 60 cents a pound. And you could easily justify a package of bees, and the Georgia packages, I think, were like $7, $8, $10 a package, believe it or not. Yeah, no, look, if you don't, check it out, look at the old bee gleaning or bee culture magazines, if you can find any. They might have an archive on the Root AI. I think AI Root prints Bee Culture, and then Dadiant and Sons prints the American Bee Journal. But if you can go through their archives and find the prices of bees, queens, packages, all the things, even 30, 40 years ago, we're talking queen bees. I think the price of a queen bee was like $2.50, under $5.
Wow.
And package bees, you could get them delivered. The U.S. Postal Service would deliver them to your door for like $10, maybe 15. But here we are today. We're paying. I think Man Lake is saying we'll deliver them to your door for $200. For package bees.
So my first bees I had shipped to me through the USPS. They came from Georgia, and I paid for my whole package, including a queen and 3 pounds of bees with the shipping. And let me tell you, my friends at the USPS were very eager for me to come and pick those bees up. I think it cost me like $265. I recently purchased the Saskatraz bees, which I picked up in like northern Vermont, and they were still like $260 because that particular breed is more expensive. So it is one of those things where you're feeling very inspired to keep them alive, because you don't. I get attached to them, but I certainly don't want to be replacing them every year, because then it feels
you have to figure how many pounds of honey do you need to make for that to pay for itself? $260 worth of honey. If you can get $10 a pound, right? You just do the math.
Yeah.
I'll be right back. I just got to grab something real quick.
Okay, sounds good. So for anyone who's a little late getting in, Troy's going to get started here in a few minutes. As soon as he gets back, we will let him get going. It looks like he's set up in his beautiful shop there, because Normally Troy is with us at the store, and unfortunately, you know, because of COVID, that's not possible, but we are kind of getting a really beautiful sneak peek into all of his operation there. So that's kind of fun. And we will try to hold questions until the end. But certainly do feel free to put them over in the chat. I've seen that we've had a couple over here in the chat so far, and that's totally fine to do because we can, you know, if Troy doesn't touch on them throughout the presentation, we'll circle back to them for sure. So. All right, Troy, we're going to let you take it away. I'm going to mute myself just in case my very large pack of dogs decides to start talking. So you can go ahead and take.
All right, thank you guys. It's nice to see everybody. I think at hopefully some point soon we'll be able to see everybody at some with these programs face to face in the future. I kind of despise Zoom meetings. I'm glad that I don't have a lot of them to sit in front of quite often. But anyways, I'm just going to go through a basic on what it is to start with bees. If you guys have questions, I guess if you want to hold them till after the presentation, and then we can answer some questions and whatever you guys want to talk about. I usually ask people in a room when I can see everybody's hands raised, like how many people are just beginning. But if you guys are okay, as I say, if you're completely have no idea what you're doing, you're just fascinated by bees, you want to start this venture in beekeeping. So I saw a few people raise their hands, at least I had the cameras on. For those that don't know, just assume that you're somewhere in the middle. So I'll try to cover a range of things that are for those that are just beginning, obviously, and then for maybe a few of us that have been at it a while, and we can go from there. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here real quick. Give me a minute.
If you hover at the bottom, Troy, there should be a share screen button.
Okay, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh,
okay.
Hang on. Let me pass the baton to you. All right. So you're the host now. So you should be able to go ahead and share your screen. You have all the power.
I have the power, yeah. Broadcasting from an undisclosed location. Let's find out how I do this. All right, I think I got it here. Share that one. Wow, is that you guys seeing what I'm seeing? I guess I don't know.
I see your bees there.
Okay, good. That's all that matters. So just going to go through, what I do. So I've been doing this just long enough to know that I don't know anything about bees, and just long enough to have some success with it and experience the success. And this year in particular is probably one of the worst winters I've ever experienced as a beekeeper. Going into the winter with like 600 colonies and coming out with maybe 50. So I've lost quite a few hives. And now the challenge is how do you build them back up and try to still make it where I can pay myself and make a living at this. But at the end of the day, that's I guess part of the adventure of working for yourself and farming. So I've been doing this mainly around with the I specialize in breeding queens. And with the breeding of queen bees, there's different ways to describe it, but you can propagate something, which is simply, in my opinion, it's just like kind of like a cookie cutter. You stamp out the same thing multiple times and you just distribute that out. And then there's breeding when it comes to any livestock or animal, where you want to try to bring out what we would consider as human beings like the best in something or a desired trait. So you take the time to select for traits that are desirable and to select for things and remove traits, or to breed out traits that are undesirable. And to try to do this with bees is rather difficult. I had a friend of mine who was an entomologist who had once in his life bred fish, and he was like, it was easy to breed fish because it was like if you took some dice, a handful of dice, and threw them on the table and you just matched, if you got matches or whatever, you would match them up and you get the desired traits. But he says, like, breeding bees, you'd have to take a 5-gallon bucket of dice, throw that out, and then you get all these variables. So it's very, there's a lot that a beekeeper can do with breeding queens, and then there's a lot that that is completely kind of outside of our control, especially when you consider the sex life of honeybees, in particular the queens and drones, that they mate on the wing. A lot of people would assume that queens and drones mate, in the hive, but that is a farce. Honeybees, it's actually one of the particulars that set honeybees apart in the realm of Hymenoptera, which consists of ants, wasps, hornets, honeybees. The way that they mate and procreate, in particular, the spreading of their genes into the future, is that they mate, the drones and queens, they mate in the open, in the air, on the wing. And of course, there's been advancements in honeybee breeding in the last 60 years where you can artificially inseminate queens, which requires, harvesting semen from particular drone stock, and then, then putting that semen in the spermatheca of the queen. So it's a really intensive process, and you can get desired traits quickly. But there's been studies that have also, and there's been, just field work and hard experience that shows that you can only go so far with that too. Nature seems to know and does things, a little bit more effectively than what we can ever do at points. So anyways, I want to just touch base on what that is, as far as what I specialize in. So I use, my apiary is kind of built on three things: queen breeding. So I propagate my own queens. I sell off surplus queens to people looking for stock, good northern winter hardy stock. And part of the thing that I use with breeding queens, and that's been kind of like my niche, if you will, with what I've been doing with bees, is I haven't had to use any sort of miticides for treating for varroa mites in over a decade. But again, I here I am this year, with taking the full risk of that decision upon myself, because I lose a lot of bees as a result of it. But I've always am a firm believer. I'm looking at the big picture, and maybe I'm dumb in doing this and thinking that there's something out there that doesn't exist. But my whole logic is thinking that at some point in the near future or distant future, we can breed honeybees to be completely resistant to varroa mites. And there's a lot of debate in the bee war, in the culture of beekeeping right now, that, this type of endeavor is kind of a farce, which I can see I'm always a skeptic of the work that I do. But at the same time, over the decade of doing this, I've seen huge improvements in what the bees are capable of. So it's really opened my eyes to the kind of the limitless opportunities, and that what nature can do if you can kind of, as a farmer, just kind of like hang on for the ride and try to, direct the flow of traffic in a certain way when it comes to what nature is doing. So breeding of queens, and as a result, I test all the bees in just standard equipment, try to produce honey. So I produce a crop of honey with bees. I have like around 200 colonies that I use to make honey. So I produce honey, and actually most of my income as a beekeeper comes from the sale of honey. And at the same time, if I have a good winter survival and surplus bees in the spring, I sell those bees off to other beekeepers in the area who are looking for good locally raised stock. Because as you guys will find out, if you haven't already, sourcing bees locally is nearly impossible at some points. If you were to ask people, are these packages produced in the state of New Hampshire or in Vermont? And if they're honest with you, they'll say, no, we're bringing them up from Georgia, North Carolina, California, wherever. They're coming from somewhere else that somebody made, out of a different apiary. But to find a beekeeper who can tell you, these are my own bees, I've wintered them, I've tested them, it's a whole different net product. I always tell people, if you can buy overwintered nucleus colonies from the beekeeper who produced those bees, it's like apples to oranges from anything else you can buy. But again, they are bees all the same. They can, there's nothing really special about them in the sense that they can die just like other bees. But there's something about them that, if you guys are, if you're familiar with buying, dogs and cats, or even livestock, if you can get livestock, cattle, sheep, whatever, goats from a local breeder, you're going to find that those animals are far healthier than something you can get that's mass produced somewhere else, or just coming from some general, something that's just for the sake of cranking out numbers all the time. So without getting too much sidetracked, I'll just kind of go through some slides, and once I get a picture of a bee here, actually, since we're at the first picture here, you can see there's a queen with, and sorry that there's this stuff in the way that's blocking the real picture, but I mark all my queens. Queens can live up to, before varroa mites were introduced, which is a parasitic bee mite. For those of you that are brand new with beekeeping, varroa mite is the leading cause of bee mortality, in my opinion, in all, throughout the world. The mites have, by themselves, the mites, I think, are now becoming, and with the right genetics, the mites are becoming somewhat less virulent than they would be by themselves. But what the mites do is they vector in viruses. And that lethal concoction of mites, the parasite, and the viruses that they're presenting in the colony and in the bees themselves is a toxic mixture. So what we have is an unbalanced, if you will, host parasite relationship with bees and varroa mites. And the mites originate in Asia. There's different strains of honeybees. There's Apis cerana, which is there's one of the Asian honeybees. There's several different strains of honeybees in Asia and throughout Eastern Europe. But the Asian honeybee is where the mite originated from, and the Asian honeybee itself is resistant to this mite. But this mite found its way out of the Apis mellifera strain of bee, the Asian honeybee, and jumped onto the European strains of bees back in Europe, I think like in the 60s or maybe in the 70s or 60s. And it slowly worked its way to the United States, and they were first found in the United States, I believe, in the late 80s, early 90s. Maybe I want to say 87. Someone can check me on that and say that, check the facts out. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe the first mites were found in the United States in the 87 or something. And since then, beekeeping has forever been changed. Mortality rates in the beekeeping industry and culture, if you will, were normally around 5 to 10% winter mortality. And now, it's not uncommon if you look at the average bee mortality across the United States, you're looking at 30, 40%. Some in some cases, the bad winters are 50%. So you have 50% or 35% of the managed bee population dying off every year. And a lot of people would say that's not sustainable, and they're right in thinking that it's not sustainable. And there's definitely a lot that is wrong, and that makes it hard for bees to survive. And it's more, that's a whole conversation to itself, discussing that. But anyway, so the mite, that's the number one I don't like to say public enemy number one, because I'm a firm believer that the pests that we deal with as farmers are ways that can show us where our farming is weak, and as a farmer, how we can use those pests to show us how to strengthen our farms, and how to, especially with livestock, with bees. I look at bees as a kind of way of, it's a particular livestock, but if I can use the mites to show me how to make the bee stronger, then I think I'm in the solution and not really in the problem anymore. Because most beekeepers look at the mite as some evil enemy that has to be eradicated. And it's like, the truth is they're never going to go away. It's here to stay. How do we deal with it? And how do we deal with it so that the future generations of bees and beekeepers and people that like to eat honey and bee products don't, have to eat stuff that's constantly tainted with chemicals and all that other stuff. But again, that's a whole other conversation. So
I did check you, and it was 1987.
Oh, good. Look at that. Thank you. Yeah, we've got fact checkers. So the different castes of bees, we have the queen, which again, there's gonna be different pictures, but for the sake of while we have one right in front of us, we have the queen. She's got the elongated abdomen. She's the only fertile female in the whole colony. We have her daughters, which is, in this picture, is a great example to show you the genetic diversity of a honeybee colony. So the queens can mate with up to 15, 20 drones at a time she only mates once in her life. She'll emerge from the cell that she was pupating in. She'll spend a few days developing her flight muscles, and her exoskeleton will harden up. So she's like a fully adult queen. And at that point, she'll spend a few days orienting her flight around the colony she's located in. And then she'll take off on several mating flights, or one mating flight. But her whole thing is she has a special organ. It's called the spermatheca in her abdomen, which she stores semen, sperm in. And once that spermatheca is full, she is done mating. She has enough semen to last her for the rest of her life, which can last, I've seen the oldest queen I've had live here is 5 years. And that's only happened once in my, 15 years of beekeeping. I've seen a lot of queens make it to 3 or 4 years, but seldom do I, 5-year-old queens are kind of really hard to come across nowadays. But again, before mites, it wasn't uncommon for some honeybee queens to live to, I believe, 8 years or 6 years or something like that. So you have the queen, the worker bees, which you can see have their abdomens are kind of what you're familiar with the bees honeybees you see visiting flowers and blossoms in the spring and throughout the summer months. And then at some point, I'm going to show you guys a picture of a drone. I don't have a picture of one here, but again, what I wanted to show you is the different colors, the phenotypes of the bees. You can see you have a really dark bee here, which is very common for a carniolan strain of bee. There's different strains of European bees. You have Italian bees, which are kind of like these lighter colored bees, the yellow, orangey, 3-banded colored bees. Again, which most people look at honeybees, they look for that golden color. But you have darker strains of bees like this, which are Caucasian strains, carniolan strains. Even some of the Russian strains are dark like this. And again, some Russian strains of bees are also kind of a golden color as well. So in this one picture, I am looking at like maybe I can see 3 different fathers, if you will, because if the queen's mating with 15 different drones, that means you have 15 different subfamilies in one colony. They all come from one mother, so they all share the mother's genetics, but they all have different fathers. You'll have maybe a 30% have this father, 30% have this father. So it's like this super organism that has this huge ability to share the load genetically. And it's so complex. It's amazing the complexity and the simplicity of what the genetic makeup of a honeybee colony is. So anyways, basics in beekeeping as we move into and out of winter here as in the upper valley in this part of New England. I'm assuming that most of you folks are zooming in from somewhere nearby. So I can kind of talk local in a sense. Our winter looks like it's starting to kind of show its weakness a little bit, but I dare not say that ever in the month of March, because as we know, April we can still get a nor'easter and another foot. So winter is definitely not over, but it's nice to see nice sunny days and some thawing happening. And right now, if you have honeybee colonies that are alive, then it's best this is the perfect time to get out, get sets of those bees live or dead, first of all. And if they're alive, to assess whether or not they need food. Do they have combs of honey right up against the cluster, or are they barren of honey and do you need to supply them with some syrup? Or maybe if you know someone else who has combs of honey and their colonies are clean from disease or American foul brood or whatever, then you can source honey like that. Or if you have another dead colony right next to it, that's where again, like you didn't see any issues with American foul brood or anything in the previous seasons, you can just take honey from dead colonies and move that onto the colonies that need the food. But so yeah, if you have colonies that are alive, then you want to make sure that they have food and just that they're well provisioned until April when they can start bringing in pollen. And at the same time too, if you've been at this long enough, or if you just have bees coming through the winter, now is a little early for me, in my opinion, if you wanted to start feeding protein like pollen substitute or pollen patties. I usually would wait I always try to wait to feed pollen substitute about 2 weeks before the start of a natural pollen flow, which is hard to predict. I've seen pollen being brought in from bees as early as I think right now, like the second week in March. And then I've seen pollen start to be brought in anywhere from the second half of March all the way up until I've seen pollen delayed being brought in by bees until the second week of April, depending upon the season. So again, I always figure it's safe to start feeding pollen and to get those colonies stimulated to raise brood anywhere after the second part of March. And then the trick is though, when you start feeding pollen substitute, that you need to continue in feeding pollen substitute, because once they exhaust their own resources of protein in the colony and you stimulate them to start raising brood, they're kind of on this treadmill where they have to have protein now and they just can't turn it off. And if you do stop feeding them protein, it's at the compromise of the colony and their ability to raise a healthy generation of bees. So when you're feeding pollen, continue to feed pollen and continue to feed, making sure that there's carbohydrates, honey or syrup. And it's advisable, I would say, don't feed syrup until the bees can fly regularly, because you don't want to contribute to dysentery. When you have a lot of moisture in the bees' diet and they can't fly regularly and defecate, then that just sits in their gut and they can get diarrhea or dysentery pretty quickly. So feed syrup. You can begin feeding syrup once the temperatures are regularly in the 50s, when they can get out and fly daily and do their thing and get back in the hive. So these are just some pictures of some bee yards in I think early December when I winter them, and things have changed over the years. I don't winter them somewhat like this anymore, but this is just some photos and the slides that we'll get onto here. So this is what we like to see in the springtime. I like to see our healthy populous young bees. Low mite levels is ideal, but again, I'm at the point now it's like the bees can kind of deal with mite levels that sometimes don't line up with what best practice or best management levels are. And I don't want to deceive you guys, because what I have for bees are different from what you guys are going to get for bees. But usually you want to keep an eye on mite levels. I would say just beginning in beekeeping, you need to know what the mites are doing, at least have an idea. So checking mite levels, and I can explain, if someone wants to remind me of how to look for mites or how to check mite loads in a beehive, just after this presentation, remind me and I'll show you guys how simple it can be. Upper entrances this time of year in the spring is crucial, because if they're buried in the snow, the only way they can get out is if you dig them out, or if they have an upper entrance above the snow and they can access the outside through that. Keeping your mouse guards on is good right now, because again, the bees are kind of in cluster. They can't move around and chase out any mice that try to get in and chew on the combs. So mouse guards are good to keep the mice out. Protection from the prevailing winds is a nice thing to have too. So southerly, easterly exposure for an apiary. And at the same time, if you've got a lot of, if your exposures to the north, those prevailing winds can have an impact on their ability to winter. So just having some insulation or some protection from the wind. There's so many ways to winter beehives, how to prepare them for winter. That's again a whole nother conversation and a whole nother meeting unto itself. But the basics are what I do is I just use some tar paper, 15 weight tar paper, wrap it around the beehive, and then I use an 1.5 inch blue board or foam board cut to the dimensions of the hive that sit right on top of the inner cover, and that's mainly just to keep warm air from condensation or condensating back onto the bees once that, because they're not hibernating, and since they don't hibernate, they generate heat all winter. And if that heat hits that cold inner cover, it's going to create moisture and that drips back on the bee. So that insulation is really just to keep that warm air from condensing immediately to that surface it first comes in contact with. So as we move into spring, which will be here before we know it, it's crazy to think that these apple blossoms will be looking at us, by the 12th to 5th of May. It's great. Yeah, it's like it's what, 2 months from now. It's pretty crazy to think how quickly things build up. But bear with me on this next picture, guys. So obviously these bees aren't sticking to the wall, but the photos, you have to just turn it upright, upright, facing the right direction. This is a typical colony that I see coming through the winter. I typically now will winter most of my bees in 2 deep supers, and as those who are just beginning, let me just keep moving here so I can get a better picture. But essentially, this is what a strong populous colony looks like coming through the winter. You have 2 deep supers with these bottom boxes and 1 medium super, or some people will call a honey super. And when you have a colony where you take off the outer cover and the inner cover is full of bees like this, and you pop off the inner cover and there's still more bees, it's like, oh my gosh, where do the bees end? I have the special bench that I use that saves my back. And I would suggest that anyone who's doing beekeeping for any length of time, try to come up with a way to get and work your equipment off the ground. Or if you're always bent over, that, just remind yourself that, some of you guys are much wiser and older than I am. You know yourselves and your backs better, but I'm at the point where I can start seeing if I had to do everything from the ground, I'd be in trouble in a few years. So I built this bench. I can tip the hive up onto it like this. It's at a comfortable working height off the ground, and I can work all these supers. But so here's my point. The top of the colony is here with this honey super, and the bottom is here. So this whole cavity, all these boxes are full to the brim from top to bottom coming out of winter. So that's a very, very strong colony of bees. And it's not uncommon, for me to see a lot of them look like this, but just not this winter. So if you have a colony like this, as a beekeeper, you have a huge potential to be very successful for the season. But the next part, and it kind of goes beyond our discussion tonight, is how to manage these bee colonies for production of honey, for production of whatever you want to do. Even if you want to be a hands-off approach beekeeper and just say, I want some bees to pollinate my local neighborhood, or it's funny how a lot of people say, I want some bees to pollinate my garden, and seldom do you ever see bees pollinating your garden right in your backyard, unless you're there all day long, because you've got to remember, bees are visiting flowers at certain times of day. If you're familiar, I have a few strawberry growers in my backyard. They're like, I never see a darn bee on those blossoms, and it's like, oh, you know what, I was out there at 3 o'clock and those flowers are full of bees. So the bees visit flowers when they know how nectar is being produced from the blossoms. At certain times of day, some blossoms don't produce nectar, but when they start to produce nectar at a certain time of day, you better believe that there'll be bees all over it. So just because you don't see them at a certain time of day, if you were to say, all right, let's check what my garden looks like throughout the day and see what bees or what's visiting the different blossoms, will determine what's producing nectar and enticing bees to come visit the blossoms. So what I did, and again, I don't want to get caught up in the weeds here too long, because I don't want to get into advanced kind of techniques or whatever for beekeeping, but one way to manage this colony from swarming, and swarming is a natural occurrence in bees. It's how they naturally procreate. When they get to a population this strong and they're limited on space in the cavity they're occupying, they will want to cast a swarm where essentially half the colony leaves, half the colony stays. And for them to do that, they need to raise a new queen. So as beekeepers, we're always keeping an eye out for what is called a queen cell. And I think I might have some pictures of some queen cells coming up, but essentially they look like a peanut that hangs from these combs, these frames. And that's a sign that once you see that, it's like sometimes it's too late. But if you can catch them before they raise the new queen, they're never going to swarm without a new queen. So as long as you can stay ahead of that process, then you're good. So what I like to do is give the bees more room than they need to alleviate that swarming tendency. So a colony like this, what I'll do in April, and actually what I start to do in May, is reverse the supers. So most of the brood in this colony is here at the top. in the spring, because the bees have eaten their way up to the honey and they kind of just sit themselves right at the top of the colony. And then in the springtime, as a beekeeper, if you want to stay ahead of the bees, you have to put that brood back on the bottom board, which is this bottom wooden board here. And then you get put all the empty supers above. So essentially you're giving empty space above the queen, which keeps her busy. She has plenty of room to lay still, and that really alleviates the swarming pressure or tendency. So this is what that colony looks like when you reverse your supers. The bottom supers on the bottom, the middle super stays always where it is. If you have two deep supers, it's easy. You just take the top row, reverse it to the bottom. But in this case, where you have three supers, then you just keep the sandwich the middle one continually in the middle and just reverse the top to bottom. And you can stay ahead of the bees for at least a few weeks. But then you want to start giving these colonies supers of honey pretty quickly, especially once the dandelions are in bloom. So I'm just going to go through these notes because some of these points aren't really, I think all that crucial for what we're trying to do as far as just beginning with bees. For equipment, for those that are, again, just novice in beekeeping, the equipment, these deep supers here, the deeper depth boxes are called deep supers. They're 9 and 5/8 inches deep. This medium one on the bottom is referred to again as a medium super or a honey super. It's the same, it's interchangeable, the terms. Sometimes the deep supers are also referred to as brood boxes, but it's a deep super. The reason for the different depths in supers is mainly weight management. A deep super full of honey will weigh about 80 to 85 pounds. A medium super full of honey can weigh up to 60, 65 pounds. So when you're buying your equipment, just think of what you're getting into for weight management. And if you have a hard time lifting 60 pounds, then you definitely want to be careful with how many deep supers you use. I've seen it nowadays where it's not uncommon for beekeepers who are getting along in their years or just aren't very strong and can't manage the weight, that they'll just use mediums. Everything will be in medium supers. And then it's just about, cubic inches of space that you're using as a cavity. For example, I think 2 deep supers is the equivalent of 3 medium supers. And most, like, if you want to consider like the home of the bees is going to be mostly in 2 deep supers throughout the season. So, and then everything above that, if you want to produce a little bit of a honey crop for, surplus honey that they're going to produce, then you give them some, again, just pile on the mediums until they stop filling them at the end of the season, then take them off and harvest them. So I'll keep going. And again, I feel bad because I know you guys probably have some questions, but I want to make some time. Actually, Don, if you can kind of interject at some point, like I figure if we have maybe 20 minutes before the end of it, because I think you guys have a lot of questions. I want to answer some questions. And if we run out of questions, I'll keep going. But what's important to do is, again, like we said, assess the winter survival, or if you don't even have bees. Right now, it's coming down to the line. If you need to buy bees, I would say get busy trying to find someone to buy bees from, because the longer you wait, the less of a chance you're going to find that there's going to be bees available. You want to make sure that you have your equipment assembled and ready to go by now. If you don't, you need to get busy with putting stuff together. There's so many different ways to buy equipment. I'm pretty old fashioned in a sense. I like all my equipment made out of wood. And I don't know if you guys, I'll have to show it, but I've been making my own foundation lately. I have tons of cappings wax, and I bought a foundation mill just over the winter. So I've been making my own foundation. It's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. And it's nice to have just my own beeswax and my own combs and just having it all kind of done in house. So anyways, there's different types of equipment. You can buy plastic frames. Everything's ready to go. You don't have to assemble it. You don't have to, nail stuff together. Most of the supers, these boxes that are called supers, are made out of wood. There are some styrofoam or polystyrene ones that you can buy. They do have better R value, but they are a little more expensive and they're a little bit more fragile to work with. And I once heard a beekeeper saying, "I hate keeping bees in my beer. Why would I want to keep bees in my what did he call it? In his beer cooler," or something like that. And it's like I kind of chuckled at him because he had something against polystyrene on a beehive. But anyways, so wood's mainly what's used. White pine around here is the staple ingredient for making supers. For those of you that can make your own equipment, it's very easy to make. Again, the dimensions, you can find the dimensions on any, if you Google, super dimensions, honeybee equipment dimensions, you can find it pretty easily. I'm just going to keep moving through here to find some stuff that's pertinent. These are just some pictures of different colonies coming out of winter into spring. Not to confuse you guys with this equipment here. This is what I use specialized for raising or mating the queens. I have these boxes where I can split them into 4 ways, and they're all on these little baby combs, and I can find the queens on them pretty quickly. As we move into the summer months of beekeeping, this is where things kind of, continue on and where things can get fun, especially if there's a busy year for the bees to make honey. The colonies start to get really tall. So like I mentioned before, you'll see that the bottom of these stacks or these colonies, you have those 2 deep supers. That's where most of the colony is being, like, if you want to call, like, the house, the bee's home in a sense, where the queen is laying brood, where all the, young nurse bees are taking care of the brood, and the population's being, really, coming from this part of the hive. These extra boxes are what the bees need to put up surplus crops of honey. So the best way to describe how bees produce honey is a little bit like how bees are natural hoarders. So if you give bees more space than they need at a time in the year when there's honey or nectar available, which is during the summer months or the spring months, produced, when things are growing, then bees are natural hoarders. They're going to take all the resources they can get their little paws on and bring it back to the hive and ripen that nectar into honey. And as long as nature continues to make those resources available, they'll continue to produce honey. And that's what makes, like everything in farming, some years you get good years for honey, some years you don't get good years for honey. It's not uncommon, if you have strong beehives in this part of the world and in a good location for honey, that you can't produce 100 to 110 pounds of honey in a good year. In an average year, I'd say 85, 70 pounds of honey is probably the average. So, if you have good area, good location, and healthy, strong colonies, you will produce some honey. And again, each one of these medium supers on the top of these stacks of colonies will extract, like when you spin out the honey in an extractor, will yield about, if they're completely full, they'll yield about 33 pounds, 34 pounds of honey. I usually think, some people say 35 pounds, but I've done enough of them over the years. Once I start adding up the numbers and the honey spun out over, 500 supers or whatever that I harvest, I usually find in a good year, it's anywhere from 33, 34 pounds, sometimes 35 pounds of liquid honey extracted out of each box. And then that adds up pretty quickly. So again, this summer's where you want to, when you put supers on the bees, you want to stay ahead of them. And when you're just beginning, all you have is brand new equipment. So the bees have to put a lot of energy into drawing out the combs. And the trick to, when you're just beginning, and especially in the beginning of the season in the springtime, you want to make sure that you're continuously feeding them some syrup. They need to draw the comb. Once they have the brood nest, these 2 deep supers or the 3 medium supers or whatever you're going to use for equipment established, and you want to start making honey, you need to stop feeding them syrup, right? Because if you want the integrity of your honey to be pure, you don't want to feed them sugar water, because you're more than likely to end up with sugar water in your honey. You want honey to be derived from plant nectar, because that's truly what honey is it's not sugar water. It's nectar derived from plants or blossoms that the bees ripen into honey. So again, once the brood nest is built up, take the feeders away and get the bees to start foraging on the, they're going to be foraging on the plants anyway. So you'll find out when you're just beginning that when there's a honey flow, and a honey flow is a time of year when the bees are bringing in nectar. And what does that look like? Let me see if I can find a picture here. Obviously the bees get tall. I'm trying to see if I can find a top, maybe I don't have them in here. I apologize, guys. I sometimes get so focused on certain things of beekeeping, I lose track of other pictures I can show. There's a nice picture of some queens. Anyways, a honey flow, essentially, when they start drawing out this comb, this is just imagine this is let me see if I can find a regular comb to not confuse you guys. Bear with me. These are the queen cells too, those peanuts that I mentioned that are hanging from the bottoms of the combs. They look like this, but they're not on this. This is a special frame that I use for breeding queens. So ignore this frame. These like peanut looking things will often be on a frame like this unto itself. They'll be located like right here on the bottom, or if I had the picture on, they'll be over on the edges or sometime at the top. But my whole point is that in a natural honey flow, when nectar is being brought in from blossoms, the bees will draw out these combs very quickly. And you'll notice that the frames are going to fill. See, this is a great picture. It's not showing you what nectar looks like, but these cappings right here, this wax coating here is honey. And all this, you guys can imagine what this is all pollen. So when you see combs like this being produced, and you can dump your, if you have a package of bees, you shake them into your equipment and you come back a month later and you have combs like this, it's safe to assume that they are finding plenty of resources. When you don't see this stuff happening, then as a beekeeper, you need to say, okay, I got to interject. I got to feed these bees because they need to keep growing. But again, once nature starts producing food for the bees, they're going to turn their nose up 90% of the time at the sugar water you're feeding them or at the pollen pads you got on them, because they're going to prefer nectar and natural pollen to any of the stuff we can feed them, ourselves. So when you stop seeing them taking the syrup down and they're bringing in pollens, boatloads of pollen, it's fun in the morning, especially the first half of the day. If you're watching your bees and there's a good amount of pollen they're bringing in, you're going to see it that first half of the day. You see bees, wave upon bees coming in with their pollen baskets full of pollen, all sorts of different colors. That's the amazing thing of beekeeping, is you'll become very much in tune with the flora and fauna of where you live, if you desire to do so, just by the color of pollen they're bringing in. So where was I? Just trying to think of, apiary location, like where you want to put your bees. For those who are just beginning, just make sure that you got them on some property, or your property where it's easy to work with them. Remember that these are stinging insects. So think about how you take care. If you guys, if you're avid at mowing your lawn every week or very often, think about how close do you want to put that lawnmower to the beehive. So you want them in a place where maybe you can use a string trimmer every once in a while to manage the grass. And you need to you need to consider a bear fence. I don't care where you live nowadays. Wasn't too long ago, maybe 10 years ago or whatever, there wasn't a bear population like we have today, especially in the river valley. But the bear population is here to stay for the meantime, and there's plenty of bears around. And if you don't have a fence, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when that Winnie the Pooh is going to visit your beehive and turn it in. Literally, sometimes they just tip it over and chew on a few combs. But more often than not, if there's brood in the colony, they'll just turn it into kindling. And that's a devastating thing to wake up to, is seeing your beehives just torn into a bunch of kindling out in the backyard. So put up a fence. This is a minimum. So I should be a better example to you guys, but this is like the bare bones minimum type of fence you want in your bee yard. But this has always worked for me. And I'm kind of stubborn about changing things until the bears get there, and then I'm angry. It's like, well, why didn't I do that better before? But recently, so my point is, you want at least a minimum of 3 strands. I would recommend 4 strands of wire. You want the top wire. Bears aren't great jumpers, so you have to remember, you don't need a 6-foot fence. You're not keeping out deer, you're keeping out bear. And bear will tend to dig under things more than jump over things. So you want the top strand at about your hip height or a little bit higher. You want another strand, again, somewhere in the middle. If you had 4 strands, ideally you'd have one about 8 inches, 6 inches off the ground, another one 8 to 6 inches above that. So you figure 6 to 8 inch spacing with the top one at your hip height, or at the height of your hip. Again, if it's a little bit above your hip, that's okay. I'm 5'5", I'm pretty short, so my hip is not as high off the ground as other people's. And then another thing to consider, see how this is pretty forested in this location? You don't want a tree right up against the edge of this fence with a limb coming over your bee yard, because bears are smart enough. They always think with their stomach. If they look at that tree, they're gonna say, let's just crawl up the tree, go over the limb, drop in the bee yard, have a bite to eat, and then we'll bust through that fence on the way out. So you need to keep in mind how a bear thinks. They always think with their stomach, and it's not uncommon. I've been to plenty of bee yards where you show up and there's this huge mound of dirt outside your bee fence or outside the fence, and you can see the bear dug its way or tried to dig its way under the fence, and it didn't work hard enough, so it got its head stuck on the bottom strand, and then it got zapped and it backed out. But you're left with this wheelbarrow load of dirt that you got to dig or throw back under the fence. So again, electric fences are great. I would say you can solar. I've been using a lot of solar. In this picture, you see a Gallagher B11 charger. These are kind of the old. I don't even know if West Leb Supply sells them anymore. But I've been transitioning out of these into the solar fences, which work great. I actually have some solar panel fences that Gallagher makes, and then you can get them at the feed store there at West Leb. And I'll leave them on literally all winter, all summer long, and I've got some that have been just ticking nonstop for 3 years. So they've been working pretty good. What was it I wanted to share with you guys about fences? I think that's it. If you guys have questions about fencing, just chime in. But fencing is important. Again, the location on your property is nice. If you really are kind of, if you got a lot of space to play with, southeast to exposure is important. But just kind of put them in a place where people aren't going to be right up against them all the time, because as the season changes, the bees' aggressive behavior can change too. Remember, they are honeybees. They're not always the most aggressive bees, but at that same time, they can get cranky. They can get aggressive, especially when weather patterns changes in the fall. when nectar sources dry up and they're really getting into the mindset of settling in for the winter, they get very defensive of the hive. So they can get where you once had a nice easy hive to work, they become ruthless and they just want to attack the socks to your legs. So they can change overnight. These are just some pictures, not to confuse you guys, but these are what I call nucleus hives. This is how I kind of propagate my bees and try to keep the equipment standardized. I just take a regular deep super, I make these division feeders, and I can house 2 colonies like a duplex in one box. One entrance is here, and then there's another entrance opposite on the other side. And I can winter these 4 frames of bees over the winter very nicely. This is what they look like in September. And they come out of the winter usually just in the same shape. And you can winter a bunch of them. That's what keeps my whole operation afloat, is those nucleus colonies. Let me just keep going through the slides here. Queen bees, if you guys buy queens, they're bought, you'll buy them in these cages. It's fun when you start to raise your own queens. It's kind of like some other things in life. You realize, wow, there's a lot of work into that. Maybe I'm always amazed at how some people sell queens for like 20 bucks still. It's like there's so much work that goes into these things. I've been asking 35 for mine, but even lately with the price and with how much work goes into bees and all the bees you lose, it's like I think even the price is not justifiable. But whatever. These are those mini combs. These are the combs that go in those little mini mating nukes that I have. So it's much easier to find a queen on this much surface area as it is to find a queen on combs that are, well, sorry, I keep scrolling around on this. Like imagine finding it's like, where's Waldo? You have double the surface area compared to a frame like this, where you can focus in your eyes and see much easier. And again, I mark them all so I can determine what year they were raised in and how old they are. So every year the color changes. Here's a red dot queen. This was taken a few years ago, but this queen was 4 years old when I took this picture. And then like literally a few months later, the bees superseded her and she existed no more. So the bees take care of it. This is a yard that I used to mate some of the queens in. These are all just single boxes. The bottom box here is actually a hive stand, is what the boxes sit off to keep off the ground. But I have 2 locations like this that I used to raise queens in one in Heartland, one in Plainfield. I'm going to try to skip over some of the fall stuff because usually West Lebanon Supply does a fall seminar, and I want to try to leave some time for questions. For extracting honey, in the beginning, I would say if you find another beekeeper in your neighborhood, or I'd just say if you want to become part of a local bee club, which they are plenty to be had right now, you can borrow other beekeepers' extractors, or the club usually has, local bee clubs have extractors you can rent or borrow, because they get expensive, and you're going to use this piece of equipment maybe like for a few days out of the whole year. Then it's sitting above the garage or in the corner or in the closet for the rest of the time. So until you start really getting committed to bees, or you feel like it's something you want to buy, you don't really need to buy the equipment up front. And I would say if you feel that way, then save your money and borrow someone else's. This is my operation. I have 2 30-frame extractors to keep everything going. And in a good year, this is a drum of honey, but I'll harvest about, well, I think in 2019, I harvested close to 18,000 pounds of honey. Last season, I did about 14,000 pounds. And I was really amazed that I could even get that because it was so dry. I was wondering what type of honey crop I was even going to get. So I was really surprised to get what I was able to harvest. Japanese knotweed, a lot of conservation. If you're a big conservation guy or girl, and you're all about natives, then you're not going to like this picture. But bees love knotweed, and I'm always a proponent of it, especially in areas like this. Like seriously, what else are you going to use this land for? Like people always thinking we just got to get rid of it. It's like, well, why? You're not doing anything there unless you plan on planting a garden or putting a parking lot in. Like leave it alone, And it's a huge resource for pollinators going into the winter. If we didn't have it, I would be hard pressed to say what could fill the void for a food resource right now in our location. This is a nice picture of an apiary of nucleus colonies. They're all in single deep supers, and you can see the goldenrods just starting to flower. So that's, we're getting into the second half of August, late August. These are some pictures of some beehives, again, in late August with some honey supers on them, just trying to catch whatever little bit of a fall honey crop I could. And what you see here, this picture on the beehive on the right, that's called bearding. And bees are very good at thermoregulating the temperature of the colony. They try to maintain the brood nest always at around 95 degrees because that's where the brood needs to be temperature-wise to develop. And if it's hotter than that, what the bees do is the population just moves, and kind of like down south, they just hang out on the porch. And that's what they're doing here. You have the bees just hanging out, trying to make space inside the hive to move air around. And then once it cools down, they all just march back in. But when you have big, strong colonies of bees with big populations, this is what they're going to do in the hot summer days. And when you see this, you know, you're going to think, oh my gosh, they're going to swarm. Well, yeah, it's a good sign that you got a strong colony, but it doesn't always mean they're going to swarm, especially if you're managing them and you're staying ahead of that swarming impulse. And there's no reason to worry. They're just thermoregulating and bearding. But again, some more pictures of some bearding colonies. It's so fun to see these bees do this. Here's another picture of some bearding bees when they just cover the whole outside of the hive. And if these were feral bees, if this was like in a hollow in a tree somewhere in the woods, you'd see the bees up in the tree. If you continuously keep your eyes up, you would see these big clusters of bees like this in the summer. But unfortunately, feral beehives have become hard to find in our location just with varroa mites. Nice single deep, or this is a double deep colony, I think in early September. By the way, these ferns look here in the picture, it's still pretty green, but this is like what they look like going into the winter. And this is like what I like to do. I just like to take some of the supers sometimes and flip them up, and you can get an idea how strong the colonies are, because if you leave them like this for a few minutes, all the bees kind of crawl up to the top and begin to present themselves. Getting the bees ready for winter. I'm not going to linger here too long because this is kind of specialized and I don't want to confuse you guys any more than I already probably have. But I wrap all these single nucleus colonies together in a 4-way pallet, and it kind of they're a little bit more protected this way. And I wrap them up with some tar paper and tie everything down, and they look like that going into the winter. Just move through the slides. So that's the end of the slides, guys. I want to actually open it up to some questions. I'm trying to just look at my notes.
All right, so for questions so far, the first two are sort of closely related. First one is, I'd love to hear more about why bees may have taken off this fall. Drought, question mark. Mine did. I know others had the same problem. I know I had at least one swarm this summer also. And then the other was, why do you think you lost so many colonies, is kind of like part 2 to that, I think. And then there was another
So
one.
what was the first part of the question, Dawn?
It was why so many bees may have taken off this fall. Like, it was a drought.
Like taking off.
I think what they're saying is maybe they've heard about a lot of people having their bees swarm. I know mine did at least once.
Oh, well, so I guess I'd need to specify, like, there's a difference between like absconding and swarming. And what I personally, I don't think a lot of people will see a hive. For example, if you had a beehive, forgive me guys, I should turn my phone off. If you had a beehive that was very strong in August, in July, and you came to that same colony in September and they were void of bees, so the bees were all gone, they didn't fly off. What happened is they died off. What happens is you get, when the population of varroa mites gets above the threshold in the colony, and you have these mites parasitizing all the bee larvae, it affects the lifespan of those bees. So they can't live as long as they normally would. And bees are you got to think of bees. When you look at a beehive from a beekeeper's perspective, you're managing population. And if you have a population of bees where their lives are compromised and they can't live as long, then you can just see how one generation of bees affects everything. So if the one generation of bees only lives half their lifespan, then everything is compromised drastically after that. And it just actually almost compounds itself, and it's exponential. So there are cases where sometimes the bees will abscond, but I heard the same thing from multiple people last fall, where they said my bees absconded, they left. It's like, no, they didn't, they died. I saw hundreds of colonies look like that here in September myself, and I know for a fact they didn't abscond, they died off because of high mite loads. What looks like one healthy beehive, literally, like I remember going to this one location where I have around 50 colonies, the little baby nucleus colonies, and I went in there on day 1, for example, looked at some of the brood, everything looked about normal. And then I came back literally 2 weeks later, and it's like half the populations in these colonies was gone. So it's like, they're not absconding, they're dying off. And especially if you only check your bees once a month or every few weeks, then you can miss a whole lot of what can happen and what is happening in a beehive, especially in the spring and in the fall. I always tell people, if you want to be on top of your bees, I would say get it, especially if you're just beginning, make an effort to get into your bees once a week, twice a week even. The more you can handle the frames and get comfortable with handling the bees, the more comfortable you are around them, the more you're just gonna gain confidence. And some people will say, well, you don't want to disrupt them, you don't want to interrupt them, but it's like, no, don't worry about that. You paid a lot of money for them. You need to get familiar, you need to get comfortable. and the bees are pretty resilient. They'll bounce back from any sort of interruption that you're giving them. And the second part of the question, why do I think so many bees died this year? Because of one, you had high mite loads, and I think it was literally the perfect storm. And I'm hoping that this doesn't repeat itself, because I have more questions than answers at this point. But if what has happened this last fall is something that is going to continue to happen more regularly, then we're in for a lot. I don't know what to tell you. It's a scary scenario for bees, at least on my end. But if it's not a regular occurrence, if it was like truly a perfect storm event where you had drought conditions that in most colonies where they could, when you have a drought, the bees go into this conservative mindset where they stop raising brood. And when you do that at certain points, especially in September and late August, you need those bees to continue to raise brood to get the mites, to get the population ready for winter. So when you have a bottleneck and all the mites are focused into this one generation of bees, then that whole generation is compromised, and then they just die off. So that's what I was seeing, and what my hypothesis, or what I speculate was going on. And you know what the reality, it's kind of maybe it's just the old-fashioned way of that things are. It's like oftentimes there's no answers. Like you can consult like these really lofty entomologists, people that do all the research, and it's like even then at best they're just speculating some of this stuff. And it's like, as a farmer doing this, like I wish if there were some students from like UNH or UVM that wanted to do a research project, it's like, come and find out what the heck's going on here. Like, find out why, like as a farmer, all I can do is speculate why they die. I got a good idea. I mean, I've been doing this just long enough to kind of see what things look like, but it'd be nice to know what is going on. But again, I'm just kind of ranting. Time will tell. But to answer the question, it was the drought definitely had part to do with it. And I think high mite loads those two together were just a lethal cocktail to the bees the last season. I don't know if there's any other questions. Oop, I can't hear anything, guys.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself.
I was going to say.
So one of the questions, another one is, do you suggest one has plenty of empty supers on hand in the summer? I imagine that's probably having to do with like adding them if you're noticing. Maybe talk a little bit about like when you notice, like when it's appropriate to add another super, like if you're noticing that there's crowding or what have you, maybe talking about that.
Great question. So if you're working with, all you have is foundation, then you can't add the same, it's kind of, you have to do things differently than if you had drawn comb. Drawn comb is like the gold standard. If you can do a lot more with drawn comb than you could with foundation. So if you have foundation, you usually just give them one super at a time. And there's different techniques to entice the bees to move up into that foundation and start drawing it out. If there is no honey flow in progress, the bees will be very, very reluctant, sometimes downright stubborn, and they'll just turn their nose up at the super you put on. And you'll come back, a couple weeks later, and they swarmed on you, and you thought, I gave them more room. Why did they swarm? Well, bees look at foundation differently than drawn comb. They look at foundation like we would look at moving into a house with just 2x4s and the drywall is not even mudded yet. They got to mud it, they got to paint it, it's not even finished. But when you give bees drawn comb, that they look at that as like, wow, I'm moving into a fully furnished, this is ready to go. We got to put food in the pantry. That's it. So the way bees react to foundation to drawn comb are two different things. So if you have foundation, one super at a time, and I would say it's a technique called baiting the super. You take frames from below, in the super below, and you move at least 2 or 3 up into this new super, and you space it out so you have a drawn comb and an empty, frame of foundation, drawn comb. And usually that's enough to just get those bees to kind of be moved up into that new super and start to draw it out. But the reality is too, if there's a really good honey flow in progress, there's been some years where I'm just in such a jam and I know there's such a heavy honey flow, I just take foundation to supers of foundation and drop it on the bees. And more often than not, they move right up and start drawing out the comb. But I would advise against doing that unless you know what you're up to. Because sometimes you can do that even with strong honey flows. And if you got really swarmy bees, they'll still swarm on you. So it's always nice to, when you have foundation, just move a few frames up into that new super to bait that super. If you have drawn comb, then it's just all you really got to do is drop that box, drop the super on the bees, and they'll take right to it instantly.
It's funny that you mentioned that. That's exactly what happened to my bees. I added a super and it had the wax frames in it, but they
Yep.
like the pre-made frames, but it was covered. They were the yellow frames. They were coated in the wax,
Yep.
the beeswax, and I put it on there because I was noticing they were running out of room. I didn't want them to swarm. And I put it on there. They went up, they stripped all of the wax off of the frames, used it to cap, and then they
Yeah.
swarmed. Like I actually drove by my hive and I watched this massive cloud of bees just, they were gone. I was just like,
You wait, bye-bye.
no.
Yeah.
I actually saw them in the tree. They were about 80 feet up. Nothing I could do, but that was the exact scenario that happened to me. I noticed, so I put a honey super on. I didn't have any drawn comb on my honey super sized frame, so I couldn't like bait the honey super,
Yep.
and they just took off on me. I was
Oh
just like,
man.
it was like
Yeah.
this really like exciting thing to see because it was an incredible sight. But then I was just like, oh no.
No, it's frustrating, but at the same time, yeah, you got to find the silver lining. It's fun if you've never seen a swarm take place. It's so magical.
It's
The
wild.
sound, yeah. But to answer there's another part of that question. How do you know when to add supers? I would say when you're building up packages, when let's say you would install a package just in one deep super, or again like maybe one or maybe I would say I don't use medium super, so I'm kind of stupid or I'm just not really well versed with the way to dump packages and medium equipment. But I'd say at least one medium super, you dump a package in that, and maybe even give them the second medium right then and there, so they have a little more space. But if you're using standard deep, like the deep supers or whatever, I don't know, they're right behind me, but those deep supers, then once they have, if you have 10 frame equipment, 10 frames in a box, once like 7 or 8 combs are drawn out, the foundation has been drawn out into comb, at that point, give them another super. And the same thing for the second super. Once they got 7 to 8 combs drawn out in that super, then just start putting your honey supers on. So yeah, that's a good question though. Oop, you're muted again.
I did it again. My dogs keep getting a little bit excited because they hear somebody other than me. I don't have any other questions unless anybody else has something. This has been recorded. We do carry the equipment that Troy was talking about as far as like, the whole kind of setup and the frames and all of that. We do have all of that available. We do have the fencing. It was funny, you definitely schooled me in the fencing because my fencing is completely inadequate. So I guess I'll have to revisit that quite soon.
There was a question about particular crops or plants. My biggest proponent, and I don't mean to interrupt, Don, but just for a few seconds. If you are a landowner, if you have substantial acreage, when I say that, if you have 3-4 acres of open space, or just like space that you can utilize for, and if you're not using it as a garden, or you don't have cows or horses or something, or you don't if you're not haying it, or if it's not put to use in a sense like that, and it's open space, it's not forested, then I would say if you just can plant, actually, I was going somewhere with that thought. I just lost my train of thought. Actually, here it is. I get so frustrated when I see open land, like land that's just kind of like open. It's not used for anything. It's just a field. It's no one's haying it. It's just open space. And you see these guys out there on their fancy Kubotas in the middle of the summer, brush hogging that thing. I'm like, what are they doing? Are they just wasting diesel or what? But it's like, if you have land like that, wait and cut that until the goldenrod goes to seed, which is typically mid-September, late September. That's the best thing we can do for pollinators, not just bees, but pollinators. Think of the milkweed. I see that, monarchs are kind of in a struggle right now because their habitat, especially in our area, there's, housing developments. And again, just keep space open. And if you want to keep space open and keep, trees from growing up, you only need to cut it once a year. But when you cut it in late September, early October. And that way everything's gone to seed, everything's gone to bed for the winter. But if you're out there cutting that stuff in July, I have a neighbor right down the road. I got to go down to his house one day and give him a bottle of honey and lecture him about what he's doing. But he'll cut that the goldenrod literally right before it blooms. It's like ready to pop, and he's out there just brush hogging it. It's like, give me a break every year. So it's like, I always tell myself, I gotta get down there and educate him about not to cut that, and maybe sweeten the deal with some honey, and he'll wait another literally like 2 or 3 weeks. But that's my biggest that I've seen throughout the Upper Valley is just this really nice land that's just open, and just these guys go out with their brush hogs and clear it off because maybe they got nothing else to do. They want to make it look like it's a golf course. But it's like, if you really want to keep the ecology healthy and support pollinators and bees, then that is, you think about all the flora that is being just disturbed immensely when you brush hog meadows like that. If you wanted to plant stuff for plantings, if you're doing like cover crops, if you have livestock that you're feeding, I'm always a big proponent of alfalfa. Unfortunately, I don't think we have the right soil around here in some parts to grow alfalfa, or it's like a dying cover crop. If you go up to the Champlain Valley of Vermont, it's really still heavily planted up there. But if you have bees and you have alfalfa as a cover crop, every time you cut that stuff, it grows back. And heck, if you're just a beekeeper and you plant alfalfa, it's a huge source for honey. Clovers, white sweet clover, yellow sweet clover. If you're into cover cropping and trying to choke out weeds like rye with hairy vetch, a mix like that is always a good cover crop, or a good way to kind of keep some land use if you're farming. Another way is buckwheat. Buckwheat's a great source. It germinates very quickly, very easily, and it's usually some sort of food for the bees. So good question though. I always kind of get a little ruffled when I see all this land. That just, again, I can go on about it, but that's just beekeeping. For me, it's I look at things differently than some other farmers do. They just kind of see it as, well, let's just keep the grass down. It's like, no, keep it, let it grow, man. So you're muted.
I didn't say anything at that time.
Oh, good. Okay. All right, I'll quit nagging you about that.
No, that's okay. It was totally legitimate because I definitely kept forgetting to unmute myself. There's if anybody else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type it into the chat. And if not, like I was saying, this will be posted on our Facebook page and our website, and you'll be able to go back and review it. And we absolutely do plan to go and do a fall one with Troy, which is really great because he talks about how to get your hive ready for the winter, which in and of itself can be like, it can feel very daunting, and like, because you'll see so much from like wrapping them in these really big, thick, expensive blankets and all of these various things, and moisture boards, and Troy does a really great chat about that as well. So definitely do keep an eye out for our fall one that we will do with Troy. Troy, what is the name of Troy's farm? Hall Apiaries is Troy's. You're out but in Plainfield, just on the West Lebanon border, right?
Yeah, like well, if you're right off the interstate, if you're just to get off exit 20, if you're heading you'd be heading south, take a right. It's about I think 4.5 miles off the interstate.
And we sell Troy's honey in the store.
Yeah, it's right in the backyard of Edgewater and McNamara Dairy.
Right. That's where I was thinking. Out by like the Riverbend Veterinary Clinic and all of that.
Yep. So, and I was thinking, my brain is like a sieve right now. I have thoughts, but then they vanish. Oh, I was thinking like different, like for plantings, like trees, because trees are another great resource nectar wise. Basswood is always a good, basswood, locust. Those basswood in particular is like the later season bloom. It blooms in July, and usually we have a dearth and nectar. Like there's not much for bees to really forage on from mid-July to like the middle of August. So if there's, it's kind of in this particular climate, growing zone that we're in, like 5, what are we in, 4, like 4 to 5, depending upon how close to the river you are. If you're further off the river valley, then you're in 4. But it's hard to find. Some people, they'll look at these magazines and they say, well, this will germinate or bloom and produce for bees in mid-July. But then you look at, it's like for plant zones 3, or no, plant zones like 6 through 7 or something. So it's sometimes we just don't have the right climate for some of these later producing plants. But again, alfalfa, any of those nitrogen fixing legumes, clovers, alfalfa in particular, if that can be planted and cut regularly, that'll bloom all throughout the summer, right up until the first frost. So.
Well, thank you, Troy. We always appreciate your chats and your wealth of knowledge, and we will hopefully get to see you very soon in person.
Yes, thank you guys.
All of you guys, thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you. And we'll hope to see you soon too.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night.
You too.